Vampire 2.0 by Amos 1.0. Sorry, but we just can't hire you, Retz heard for the umpteenth time. The reason was always the same, and it was always delivered in the same manner, though this speaker emphasized so many of his words. Your disability has disqualified you from this kind of work. Retz wasn't disabled. He was a perfectly normal human being whose limbs functioned, his muscles worked, and he didn't have any diseases or delusions or psychosis. His problem was that he, literally, was too human.
I could do just as much work as your net jockeys, he said. Even without a D&L. I'm skilled in Colmac and Dvorak. I type 18 lines per minute. I have a top-of-the-line terminal, and I can't be distracted by side programs. I have laser precision focus on my task until they're utterly complete, and I get it right the first time.
That's all very impressive, Mr. Wildefair. But dynamics is the future, and company policy requires every employee, down to sanitation, to have a direct neural link to the free net. He sighed. Look, we don't hire typists. We need people plugged in, real time. Retz sighed and leaned back in his chair. This was the only defeat he wanted to let the megacorp see out of him, but he was officially out of avenues. Look, Retz said, under his breath, eyes closed and hand raised halfway towards massaging his aching temples.
Where do I get work? How do I eat?
The interviewer's face went from gentle sorrow to disdain and disgust. I suggest you work for it, Mr. Wildefair. Upgrade. You're obsolete. Retz shot up from his chair, knocking it on its back, and threw a finger in the man's face. The interviewer didn't flinch. He was likely implanted with adrenal tappers and was already planning on using them to subdue his unruly, disabled slummer. Retz wanted to unleash, to tell the man what he could do with that kind of attitude. Instead, he lowered his hand and turned. This was the surface. He couldn't rely on his instincts here. He picked the chair up and set it back in its place.
My apologies, he mumbled. I what? I forgot my place? I forgot that I'm human? I forgot that I'm some slumber trash? A terminal jockey? A typist? Forgot that I'm disabled? I forgot that I'm obsolete.
Yes, the interviewer said, saving Retz the embarrassment of finishing his statement out loud. Have a good day, Mr. Wildefair. I wish you the best. Retz nodded, his back still to the man, and walked out of the room, out of dynamics, and into the street. It was a long, long walk back home in the rain, back to the elevator that led down to the slums. A long way and a long time to think about how he was never going to find real work. The pit only paid in scrap, which was only worth giving to androids for whatever human things they had and couldn't use. He was living off the worthless scrap that belonged to machines who were humanity's worthless scrap. He was the lowest of the low. Today didn't help either. He spent his last credit and pulled his final favor to get into dynamics. All of that, just to be told the same thing everyone else outside the slums told him. He was disabled. He was obsolete. He was an outdated model of human. He was old. The rest of humanity had discarded him, tossed him with all the other societal trash into the slum, the pit. Retz was still deep in thought when the elevator stopped. He could hardly remember getting to it, or even on it. He stepped off of the elevator and through the checkpoint to settle into the mud. The entire place was covered in mud, His life was covered in mud. This is how he knew he was back home in the upper New York Bay. Rhett sidestepped a slick of brackish water trickling from a crack high above, the leak persistent enough to carve a shallow groove into the mud. He glanced up at the distant skyline, blurred through the mist rising from the pit, and wondered how long the governor would ignore the slow drown of his unwanted people. Like Rhett's life, the pit was an ugly mark on New York, an acne scar on the face of North America, one better left ignored. The governor finally looked at the slums, and it was renamed, built upon, officially settled and governed, and somehow nothing had changed at all. It was still called ugly names. It still conducted ugly business, and it still housed ugly people. And it still leaked. Rhett's lived in a district far from the Bay's islands. The housing and construction grew stronger near them with paved roads and policed neighborhoods, but Rhett's lived dead in the middle of the muck and chaos of the pit, where even the police didn't bother to go. As he weaved through the alleys of tall surface scrapers, concrete and brick storefronts, between and around sheet metal shacks, the small spark of life the slums held began to glow. Beggars asking for handouts, drug deals going down, people whispering about clandestine jobs to be done topside. The festering wound began to ooze this time of night. An android stepped out in front of Rhett's. She was tall and slender. She looked almost human. Most androids did. The true flesh tissue placed on androids did its job well. The droid's true flesh was a porcelain color, and much of it was visible in the miniskirt and tank top she was wearing. Her pixie-cut hair was copper, catching the neon lights. A geisha-style collapsible fan rested in her right hand to conceal her lips and lower jaw. She stepped in front of Rhett's to block his path as she put her hip out to show off her shape.
"Hey, working man," she said, her voice husky and promising. "If you've got scrap, I've got you a good time."
Rhett's didn't have time to persuade her that he wasn't interested, so he reached out and pulled her fan down to reveal torn and drooping true flesh on her lower face. The metal framework beneath made her look particularly ghoulish, not a sight a paying customer in her line of work wants to see.
"Please,"
she whispered, looking to the side and lowering her head.
"I just need to get my face fixed. My last customer was a biter, got too enthusiastic. I'm ugly, no good. I'm junked, I'm obsolete. I'll be scrap in a week if I don't get any."
Rhett's twitched at the word obsolete, but said, "Not my problem." He pushed her out of the way and walked on. She stared, hurt, at his back. She threw her fan at him and yelled words that he ignored. He couldn't afford to help anyone. He needed help. Rhett's tried to hunch his shoulders to the slums and just get back home, but attention had been paid to him. Most attention gained in the pit was bad news. His neck itched, a feeling too common here. Eyes were on him. If he wasn't mistaken, it would be a pack of jackers looking for valuable data to siphon. Rhett's already knew how this would end. Jackers ran off of adrenaline and the thrill of what they did more than what they stole. If they knew he had nothing of value, they would beat him to get their kicks anyway. Rhett stopped in his tracks and turned around, his hands in the air. "Hey, guys," he said. He did his best to sound like he was a bored man talking to close friends. "It's me, Rhett." One man stepped out from around the corner of a sheet metal shack.
"Am I supposed to know who that is?"
the man asked. Rhett's looked him up and down. He wasn't part of the normal pack of jackers Rhett's would often see running around the slums, but he still looked it. His head was shaved, save for a 6-inch tall purple and spiked mohawk. He had conductive tattoos running from the corners of his eyes. One line went over his temples and the other under his cheekbones, both running around the sides of his face into the DNL port on the back of his head. Thick, black mascara was under his cheekbones. His eyebrows and goatee were colored neon green.
"No," Retz said, "but it's important. You see, I'm the one guy in New York that don't have a D&L.
"That's junk," the jacker spit. "Let me see."
"What kind of guarantee do I have," Retz said slowly, "that you won't just kick the hell out of me for not having anything worth your time? I just want to go home."
"We're gonna," the man said, "if you're not lying. I hope you're lying. If you're not, you better start running." He smiled with malice and made a show of licking the length of his upper lip. The bottom of his tongue held the same conductive tattooing as his face, in the same circuitry pattern. The pattern spelled out a common phrase spoken in the pit. Retz was feeling different today. He was feeling reckless and defeated. He was feeling weak and particularly unheroic. It was curious, a feeling he often subdued. Anger? No, not just anger. Wrath. He had lost almost everything, and he lost more each day that he was alive. Life was cheap these days, more so in the pit. Especially in the pit. But Retz wasn't stupid enough to gun down a jacker whose friends were still unnumbered. He smiled, lowered his hands, and cleared his throat.
"Lost what little I had today," he said. "Come and try to take the rest."
"Oh, man," the jacker said, laughing. "You're scrap." He raised his head and whistled through his teeth, a sharp and shrill sound. 4 more jackers stepped out from various hiding places. The next to come out would make the last seem normal. The hair was always shaved or spiked or some combination. Their clothes were all black leather with exposed skin, and the tattoos were all circuitry and designs reflecting death and pain and suffering. They were all long limbs and thin muscles, lean and powerful in an odd, malnourished manner. They carried a metal pole, a baseball bat, a crowbar, and the last one had a D&L plug attached to an encryptix case.
"Dynamics again," Retz thought. "How quaint. They screw me up there. Their inventions screw me down here."
Retz put his hand inside the front left half of his tanned trench coat. He had a gun, but his fingers didn't find it. It was at the home he had not yet reached. Carrying self-defense weaponry like knives, tasers, and even swords was allowed in the upper level of New York, but firearms were not. The human body was a weapon now, with the advent of biomechanical modifications, and guns were just about the only way to stop someone who really didn't want to be stopped. So only feds, cops, and corpos could carry them up top. In the pit, though, if you don't have a gun on you, it's because you're dead. Or about to be. The jackers began to shift towards corners and cover. Their faces got tighter and a wave of nervous energy flowed through them. They wouldn't back down at the threat of having a weapon, but if Retz had his gun, he could have sent them running. They would call his bluff, though. That's what life in the slums was all about, calling bluffs and taking chances. And today, Retz was bluffing. It wasn't ideal for 5-to-1 odds, but he still had a weapon. He slipped his wrist through the metal loop and his fingers into the rubber caps of his electrolyzer. He pulled his hand out and showed the jackers his weapon. The jacker with the spiked mohawk laughed. "I like your balls, old man," Spike said. "What?" Retz asked through his own laugh. "Did you even hear what you just said?" "Never mind." Retz charged. His eyes flicked to the ground to keep track of the slippery spots and mud pits that dotted the ground floor of the slums. His steps were more like calculated leaps as he moved from safe spot to safe spot, advancing on the group. He leapt over neon glowing puddles reflecting the signs and lights of the shops around them. "I'm probably gonna die," Retz thought. He mentally shrugged his shoulders. "Well,
Everyone does.
Retz made a fist. The electrolyzer was a thin, hand-shaped frame that sat on his wrist, and whenever Retz made a fist, the knuckles crackled with electricity, as they did now. Spike pulled a switchblade from the back of his pants and took a defensive stance. Retz was almost on him, dropping to his knees and planting his left hand sideways into the mud. Retz slid the last few feet forward in the muck and punched Spike in the crotch as hard as he could. The momentum of the slide threw Spike over Retz's shoulders, and electricity coursed through the man's testicles in a bright flash. Retz rolled in the mud to get behind the rest of the jackers' positions and leapt to his feet. He opened his right hand and flexed his fingers apart, the movement that told the glove to recharge. It whined, high-pitched. Spike was twitching in the mud and pissing himself. The others looked at him and back up at Retz. 4 more to go. Crowbar, baseball bat, pipe, and the guy with the dynamics tech. He looked more like a kid, barely out of puberty. 2 of them started to circle Retz, and Pipe hoisted his weapon over his head, running forward. He was already in a downward swing as the glove stopped its whine, so Retz reached out for the weapon. It slammed into the palm of his hand, and the force jarred his shoulder. Retz clenched his fist around the jacker's makeshift weapon. Electricity plowed through the metal pipe and up the arms of his attacker. The electricity contracted his muscles and glued the man to the weapon, so Retz spun and slung him out of the fight. Retz turned to face Baseball Bat next, but he just wasn't fast enough. Story of my life, Retz thought, as he saw the bat come flying down. The wood connected with the side of his head, and Retz went down amidst a field of stars and flashing lights behind his eyes. Before he even knew which of them had gotten back up, Retz was pinned to the ground by at least 2 of the jackers. He felt the small hands of the shortest member probing the hair on the back of his head, searching for a port that would allow Retz to directly link his mind with the encryptix case.
Nothin',
the kid said, his age betrayed by cracks and the pitch in his voice.
He ain't got nothin'. No plug.
What a waste of time, Spike said, his voice off-center. Retz chuckled at the sound, and a boot slammed into the back of his head, crushing his face into the mud. Take whatever you find. Leave him alive. I want him to remember something. Just for me, though. The glove came off Retz's hand. Oh boy, he thought. This won't be fun. Figured they would just kill me. The jackers flipped him over on his back. Spike had the glove on his right hand and was clenching his fist. The crackle of energy that once felt like a familiar friend now looked dangerous and painful. Retz swallowed the hard lump that sat in his throat and clenched his teeth in preparation. Oh yeah, Spike growled through a grin. He punched Retz right between the legs. Everything tried to go black, but Retz's body refused to shut down. It fought to stay awake against his will. He slipped in and out of consciousness as the jackers took turns beating him and taking his things. He felt his wallet, watch, trench coat, his lucky lighter, his cigarettes, and his DAPT all vanish into greedy hands. Smoke, Retz groaned. Leave smokes. Spike chuckled and kicked Retz in the ribs. He handed the pack of cigs and the lighter to the youngest member. Here, kid, Spike said. Enjoy 'em. They're better when you're young. They work better when you still got meat lungs. The group started to walk away. Retz watched them leave and waited until they were nearly out of earshot. The kid was hanging in the back and kept looking over his shoulder at Retz with wide, curious eyes. Kid, Retz groaned. Just one. The kid stopped and looked ahead at the group. They were fighting over the coat. The youngest one pulled one of the cigarettes out of the pack and tossed it at Retz. It landed on his chest and not in the damp mud. Light? Retz asked. The kid studied the lighter for a few seconds, used it to light one of the cigarettes, and tossed it back as well. The lighter plopped in a puddle as the kid took hold of the cigarette between his first 2 fingers. The grip was exaggerated, the kid struggling to look cool as he took off after the other jackers.
Bless you,
Retz sighed, dropping his head back into the muck. 1.1 Retz had just punched the final number into the digital lock of his door when he heard the terminal inside begin to ring. The door didn't open. The terminal wanted a scan of his eyes as well, but he just punched it instead. Like always, that worked. He pulled the door up and descended the steps into the basement of the apartment complex. He couldn't afford a room inside the building itself, but for a paltry fee, the owners let him live in the dank cellar. He shut the doors behind him and pulled his boots off. He hopped on one leg to his terminal as he shimmied out of his muddy pants. He sat at the terminal and pulled his shirt off, tossing it on the soiled pants. Retz typed his password with one hand as he pulled his socks off with the other. He didn't look at the screen or the keyboard, but he still got the keystrokes right. When the terminal unlocked, he stuck a wireless micro mic into his right ear and hit the button on the hollow board.
Retz here,
he said.
Retz, a woman's voice answered. Why didn't you pick up your DAPT? I've been calling you for the last... Are you naked?
Retz looked up. It was Clarissa, his ex-wife. She was requesting a video call, and Retz hadn't noticed. Oops.
Nothing you haven't seen before,
Retz said, no embarrassment in his voice. Besides, I know my cam doesn't point that low.
But why?
She asked.
Why not?
Retz asked back, pulling off the boxers he had urinated in. He tossed them over his shoulder to the pile of dirty clothes.
This isn't that kind of call,
Clarissa said.
I know,
Retz replied.
Just taking 'em off 'cause I pissed myself a half hour ago. Why'd you call, Claire?
Okay, she said, drawing out the word with a hint of worry in her tone.
Why did you pee your pants?
Long day, long story. Get to the point.
Make it a short story, please.
Retz sighed. Someone stole my electrolyzer and punched me in the dick with it. He grinned with no humor.
Happy? You were jacked?
She asked, her eyes wide with sudden panic.
You were jacked?
She asked, her eyes wide with sudden panic.
Can't be,
Retz said as he got up and walked to his fridge. Claire huffed with exasperation at the sight of his bare ass.
I don't have a DNL to be jacked from,
Retz said into the mic, not needing to raise his voice for it to be heard.
And so segregating yourself got you beat up and mugged instead of jacked? She asked. Sounds like you had the right idea. I should have done the same thing.
Retz dropped back in his chair with a beer in his hand. He cracked the top of the bottle against the desk and the cap flew off. He sucked down a draft and lit his last cigarette with the lucky lighter. He took a moment to recognize the irony in the title. It was lucky because it never broke and always stayed with him, apparently not because it brought him any luck.
"Did you call me just to patronize me for my life choices again?"
Retz asked around the butt as he took a drag from the cig.
"Because..."
He looked up and exhaled a thin stream of smoke before settling his eyes on Claire's face again.
"Divorcing me out of embarrassment was plenty already."
He took another drag with his eyes closed.
"I called because I heard about your interview with Dynamics today. I told you they wouldn't hire anyone without a DNL." "Yeah, you did,"
Retz said. He took another hit and sighed a cloud.
"It's called discrimination, and I thought your CEO was above that." "Don't you play that discrimination crap on me," Claire said. "You refuse to take disability or the free DNL offered to the public. Because of that, I don't think you get to cry about being disabled, even when you've had an admittedly bad day."
"Well, things change when your bad day's every day."
"Then get a port," she said, raising her voice. "And still, some things just don't change." "You don't have to start with your brain," Claire said, trying to soften her tone again. "Get something small. I'll pay for it. Just a little lung mod at least, to keep you out of cancer's way."
"I like my lungs," Retz said. He coughed and thumped his chest with his fist.
"See, they got character."
Claire growled and threw her hands up in the air.
"Why do I even care?" she said.
"I thought you didn't," Rhett said, taking a pull from the beer, his face and tone unchanging, unwilling to betray any change in emotion. "You made that clear when you left."
"You know what?" she asked, her eyes locked with his.
The video call shut out, disconnected. Retz felt the chill seep into his bones as he stared at his reflection, beaten and naked in the blank screen. Another failure. Another dead end. The hollowness inside him yawned wider, threatening to swallow him whole. When he looked back down at his cigarette, it was a stick of ash, more than half of it wasted. Retz sighed, a deep and heavy thing, and tossed the butt into the beer bottle. He threw the whole thing into the trash. It clinked, noisy against other empty bottles, the only trash in the can. He microwaved his frozen dinner and washed his clothes as he listened to his news feed of all the horrible things going on in New York. Nothing ever changed. It was always another death, another scam, more corporate espionage. It was all just megacorps taking over the underdogs, and the rich getting richer. The only thing even slightly different from what he normally heard on the news was about a prison break nearby.
Great, Retz thought. Even more trouble for the slums. God knows they'll come here.
.2 Retz entered the android reclamation facility. It was still called the Chop Shop by everyone in the slums, but his work wasn't as brutal and was still technically legal, unlike actual chop shops. Retz's job was to find androids so damaged that they shut down completely, bring them back, and break them down for scrap. Retz had no idea the guidelines used by his fellow workers, but he knew many people in the business were crooked. They would take androids that weren't fully shut down to make sure they get paid. If business was too slow, they would sometimes destroy an android, make it look like an accident, and bring it in. Being an android in the slums was a dangerous thing, which is why so many outdated models ended up ushered into the slums like all the other societal detritus.
"So you need a new personal terminal?"
Gavin asked as Retz pulled his sidearm from his pocket and nestled it against the other two weapons beside the back door. In the slums, investments had to be protected with aggression. Gavin had a shotgun, Retz a pistol, and their tech guy Suds had an SMG, all of them set into a gun shelf at the back door. Retz grunted. "I need smokes." Gavin laughed and fished a half-pack from his shirt pocket. He tossed it to Retz, the glossy cardboard box slick with sweat when Retz caught it. "And it wasn't just a PT," he said as he pocketed the box. "It had a top-of-the-line digital assistant, you know, those legally dubious borderline AIs. The last bitter gift from Claire."
"Well, we'll see what we can find you, Rhett," Gavin said. "But don't get your hopes up. We're likely to find you a PT out there, but nothing that fancy."
"Yeah, I know," Retz said. "I just wish I had you around when those jackers got to me."
"You could always just get the mods I have,"
Gavin said.
"I'm not just tough, I'm—"
Yeah, Retz waved him off and spoke with mock enthusiasm. "You're extra tough." He sighed and rolled his eyes. "How many times do I gotta tell you guys I'm just not interested in getting any kind of biomods? I like being utterly, perfectly human."
"Don't spout that quasi-religious crap to me," Gavin said. "I'm just as human as you are. Don't think you're somehow above me because you refuse to catch up with the rest of the world while it moves on without you."
"It's not a religion," Retz said. "It's a personal choice."
"Why not at least take disability?" Gavin asked.
"Are you freaking—" Retz sighed under his breath. He raised his voice and turned to Gavin. "Because I'm not disabled!" Gavin, 6 3/4 feet tall after mods, was all muscle and braided hydraulics, grinning at Retz. The man's salt and pepper beard was as wild as his personality, and the heat from the nearby smelter was making his bald head shine with moisture. His wife-beater was 2 shades darker from all the sweat than it had been at the start of the day's work. He glowed from the light of the furnace, somehow giving him an air of playful wisdom. Retz turned away from him and back to his station. The dead android he was working on was in pieces across 2 tables, both separated by Retz's large toolbox. He had just finished detaching the head. It was female and in nearly perfect condition. "We might be able to sell the true flesh off this head," Retz said, trying to change the subject that somehow always ended up on why he refused to get mods. "I met a prostitute last night."
Abrupt change of subject, but bravo, how was it?
Ha ha, her face was torn. She probably doesn't have any way to pay for it, but who knows, maybe she got lucky last night.
No pun intended?
Should I go look for her?
Gavin turned from his work to look at the head.
"I suppose," he said, running his fingers through his beard. "We have no scheduled buyers today, and there hasn't been a single walk-in in 3 weeks. It's slow enough. Go take a look."
"Gotcha," Retz said, standing from his workstation. "In the meantime, see if you can get Suds to peel the true flesh off this skull without messing it up. If we have a buyer, she'll need it in pristine condition for the line of work she's in."
"If she can't pay,"
Gavin called after Retz, his smile embedded into his words,
"tell her to drop by. I accept personal favors."
1.3 Retz reached the busy part of the slums where he had been propositioned the night before, not far from the puddle he had been beaten in. Hitmen and drug lords still walked around in broad daylight, unafraid to do anything. The police that governed the slums were few in number and didn't care to keep the whole pit in check. They stuck near the elevators that led to the surface, or in the high-end quadrants near the 3 islands. Retz didn't have his electrolyzer anymore, but he felt less vulnerable. He wasn't making any trips to the surface today, so he was packing his trusty sidearm. It was a revolver that held 7 lethal doses of lead. Retz mentally dared the jackers from the night before to try him up again today. As he worked his way through the alleys questioning other prostitutes and androids, he began to think about his life. Is this really all there would be up until the day he finally died? Just searching for people to buy scrap off of dead androids and looking for bodies to sell? How big of a deal would it be if he just got a DNL? That's it. No other mods. Just a direct neural link. He could get that job at Dynamics for sure. His life would be easier. Hell, he might even have a shot at getting Claire back. But how much of that did he want? Steady, well-paying work would be nice. He had enough to get by, but better beer and a down payment on a real casket would be lovely. A home that wasn't set into the basement of New York's basement was on his bucket list, too. And again, what about Claire? Absolutely yes. Claire was the only sure thing. He loved her and tried to make things work. She just wouldn't have it. She needed the modern world. She needed fashion. She needed tech. She needed the next great breakthrough and the highest end mods to make her the most beautiful, smartest version of herself she could be. He remembered back when she only had a DNL. They were barely adults, and she was fascinated that he didn't want one. She'd spent so much time with him to learn how his mind worked, why he refused to mod. She was curious, but that was it. He wasn't sensing the spark in her that he was feeling. He remembered finally confronting those fears. "Can I ask you a question?" he had said to her, his tone more serious than the casual days before as he prepared to ask her on a date. "Sure," she laughed. "I mean, like, as long as you're not about to ask me out." Alarm bells had gone off in his head, and his immediate reaction was to search his mind for some fake distress or drudge up an old, already dealt with issue to replace his real question. As he thought about it, though, a peace settled into his mind. She was amazing. Everything he wanted in a woman. And for a moment of pure clarity, he realized there was no point in just being friends with her. He loved her. There was no denying that of himself, and he would rather not be tortured with her presence if she would never feel the same way. "I could lie," he had told her, his words slow and calculated when his eyes drifted away from hers.
I could come up with something else to tell you since you just answered my question. I already know your answer now. There's this 99.99% chance you'll say no.
He had to swallow that day just to get the rest of the words out.
But that other 0.01%?
His lips had screwed up in thought while he pondered the words he had just spoken as they hung in the air before him. His statement had been made of rust and garbage, but he no longer had a chance to come up with something better. He nodded to himself, looked back at her, and said,
You're worth those odds. Would you like to go on a date with me?
She stood still that day with a playful smile still on her lips, pinned there only by shock and confusion. It had melted away into a blank slate as her eyes quested his for a quiet moment.
Oh,
was all she managed. During that moment, his heart beat against his ribs harder than ever before. He remembered wanting to stammer back a reply, a weak permission to deny him if she didn't feel the same way. He stood his ground despite the panic and anxiety. Hours passed in the space of a few seconds before she whispered,
Yeah, I think I'd like that.
But that was years ago. She needed more than Rhett's now, no matter if he got any mods or not. He knew that risk when he first asked her out, but like he said forever ago,
you're worth those odds.
But he would never compromise who he was for her. She wouldn't appreciate the act of him breaking his conviction, not even if he did it for her. She would always need him to have another mod to be on par with her, and then another, and one more. Always one more. Until soon you were less than half of who you were born as. It was better that it stopped where it was. The compromising, yes, but even the marriage. Her desires wouldn't have ended, and neither would his conviction. He couldn't have made himself miserable enough to make her happy, and she couldn't hold herself back for something as outdated as love. Retz was an adult and could deal with these facts, but that never changed how much his heart ached. She had been part of his life, and he loved her for that. He loved his hurt, too. It was a human thing. He wondered if having a biomechanical heart somehow did make a person think of love as outdated. A woman's voice skipped like fragmented data.
Help me.
Retz looked down an alley for the source of the noise. There was the prostitute he was looking for, torn completely in half and buried in the mud. Retz closed his eyes and sighed. He walked over to her and dropped down to his knees.
Hey there, working gal,
he said to her. She tried to fix her eyes on his, but one of them kept jerking upward and moving down.
I was looking for you. Wanted to tell you, we just got a new face in, if you could afford it. Looks like you need a little bit more than that now.
Please, ease.
I don't think there's any help for this state. I'm sorry.
Not. Me. Help her. Retz narrowed his eyes and knelt down closer to her torn lip.
Who?
He asked her.
Who do I help?
Her. Help her. Look look. Her cheek pulled back in twitching movements, and sparks flew from her torn waist. Antifreeze squirted out of her mangled neck and marked the wall like discolored arterial spray. Look in my look mind.
Okay,
Retz said, putting his hand out.
I will, I promise. But you gotta go now.
He put his hands on her cheek and slid his fingers behind her head. They caressed her DNL. He probed a few inches below that. There it was, the latch.
Please,
she repeated, the same tone throughout. It wasn't an endless cry for help, just the sound of a broken audio log.
I will,
he whispered.
I will, I promise.
Retz pulled an old piece of police equipment from his left pocket. The slummers called it the interrogator,
a tool designed to open an android's head and check their video log. He placed the elongated end in a downward angle on the latch and pulled up. The back of the droid's head popped open in a square-inch section. All androids were legally required to record everything they saw. It was an unavoidable part of their design. If they witnessed a crime, the police could literally see it through their eyes. The data was kept in a small encryptics case at the base of her skull. Retz unlatched it and slid it free. The case was supposed to be turned into the police, but Retz had just been robbed and the cases sold well. He needed a new trench coat. Besides, her last words begged him to check her video log, so it was his duty to hang on to it. With a sigh, he put the case in his pocket. "Sorry," he whispered at her corpse as he began to strap her two halves to his back to haul to the chop shop. "I wish I'd been a bit nicer last night, but guilt won't do either of us any good." Retz hoisted the straps up on his shoulders, lit a cigarette, and began the trek back. 1.4 Retz shut the door to the warehouse behind him. He walked to his table, Gavin staring the entire time. Retz unlatched the two halves from his back and dropped them to the floor near his workstation. "That your client?" Gavin asked. "She was," Retz said. "Now she's scrap." "Still no buyers come in today," Gavin said, turning back to his work. "Did you talk to Suds?" Retz asked. "Get him on the net. We got some decent parts here that he can advertise for us." "Make an inventory and I'll get him the list," Gavin said. Retz sighed and dropped into his chair, his body feeling heavier than it was. He spun the chair around to look at the body on the floor. He was glad that the girl wasn't a human, but his job ate away at his conscience. The androids were so real. They sometimes felt human. He had to keep reminding himself they were programmed that way, so they would appear human for the comfort of others. This had the opposite effect. She was human enough that Retz felt like a gravedigger. He felt he should be reporting her shutdown or taking her body to be buried. Instead, he was here to rip her apart and sell the pieces that still worked. "She isn't real," he said to himself, "and this is legal." The mantra didn't help this time. It never had. Retz hoisted her upper half onto one of the tables and sifted through his toolbox for the instruments to dismantle her completely. He started with a scalpel, slicing away the true flesh around her shoulders and neck so he could detach the arms and head. As he leaned over her torso to make the cut around her left shoulder, he noticed a rectangular lump on one of her breasts. Retz pulled the tank top down and found a PT tucked into the android's lacy lingerie bra. He pulled it out and pressed the power button. There was a crack on the screen, but it still worked. He tried to smile, or even feel happy about it, but the broken machine on the table had felt too real when it pleaded for help. Help for someone else, not even herself. Its self. "I gotta take a break," Retz said, pocketing the PT and standing up from his table. Gavin just nodded. Retz walked to the office, the only enclosed room in the warehouse. Inside was a barred-over window to the street where business deals and walk-ins made purchases with Suds. A counter at the window held the only terminal in the whole building. Suds was working on it, the terminal's net plug socketed into his D&L, a thick cable of wires, code, and information plugged directly into his brain stem. "Suds," Retz said, touching him on the shoulder. He didn't respond. "Suds, buddy, I know you're in the zone, but I gotta use the terminal for a sec." Still nothing. "Suds, I know you can hear me." Retz stepped around his friend and looked down at him. Taff Suddeth was a skinny man with skin like charcoal. His head was shaved on both sides, long dreadlocks hung limp in a mohawk fashion. His limbs were long, but his muscles lean and taut. Retz reached for his goatee and gave it a slight tug. Suds opened his eyes. "Don't touch the goatee," he said, his words slow, soft, and deliberate.
Retz always felt the man sounded snake-like and was glad they were at least passing friends. "Let me use the terminal and I'll leave you alone," Retz said.
"Fine," Suds answered. "Just trying to get the last of our salvaged software up on the net. Some of it is worthless, but a few lines and a program or two are worth actual credit."
"That's good," Retz said, "but I still need the terminal and 5 minutes alone." Suds reached behind his head and pulled the plug from his mind. When he set the cable back into its holster on the terminal, he flipped his line of dreadlocks so they were all hanging on the right side of his head. It was a ritual of his. The dreadlocks hung on the left when he was operating, and on the right when he was back in his meat suit. One of those stupid superstitions that had no bearing on anything but made the man feel better. Retz fingered the lucky lighter in his pocket, feeling his sense of superiority cower with the lighter's inexplicable comfort. Suds got up and moved out the way.
"You sure you don't want me to do whatever for you?"
"I'm sure," Retz said. "I know you're the best and I know you're fast, but this is a personal matter."
5 minutes, Rhett,"
Suds said as he stepped out of the office and shut the door behind him.
"Don't waste it whacking off."
Retz sat in the chair and placed the PT and encryptics case on the desk. The PT didn't have a password, thankfully. Retz could have gotten Suds to break it for him, but this just saved him some time. He plugged it into the terminal, factory reset it, and brought it back online with his own credentials. He downloaded a holographic keyboard onto the PT and had a display for the terminal. He took the net plug and slotted it into the encryptics case. The terminal displayed the make and model of the android it belonged to and asked for the designer's credentials or NYPD identification. Retz got to work breaking security on the box. He was confident he could get it open. He had done questionable work like this before and was good at it. He reveled in the work, let it distract his mind from all the things that had been running through it over the last few days. Retz knew if he focused too hard on those thoughts, he would realize they'd been swimming in his mind his entire life. He didn't want to bear that kind of weight, even if it meant running from it until cancer caught up with him. More than 5 minutes had passed by the time Retz had gotten the case decrypted, gaining full access to its contents. Suds still hadn't come in to kick him off the terminal, but unlike Gavin, Suds was good about realizing when Retz asked for time alone and when Retz needed time alone. Retz accessed the last hour of video that was recorded out of the android's eyes. It was all video of her lying in the mud. He kept going back until he saw something happen. It was listed as just a few minutes after 2 in the morning. He rewound the feed another 10 minutes and started a double-speed playback. There was a group of people huddled in the nook of a wall in a dumpster. 2 males and a third person lying on the ground, struggling against the other 2. The droid called out to the men. They both looked up at her. Retz's stomach flipped. They didn't even look human. The 2 men had bloodshot eyes, their bodies crouched and twisted in feral stances of pure aggression. One of them had a chunk of flesh in his teeth, and the other had blood on his hands. The person below them was screaming, crying, still flailing limbs to push the attackers away, until one of them turned her entire face into a red smear with a single swing. Retz swallowed back bile that threatened to spill out. The android took a step back. The 2 men bolted toward her, and she turned, running. She rounded a corner and nearly knocked over 2 women. She fell and pushed herself back to her feet to see the 2 men round the corner and leap at the women. The android hesitated for a moment, its code about protecting and not attacking humans conflicting with the feral humans right in front of her. The view shook with her head as she ran back to the group and kicked one of the men in the face. He howled and flew back, thrashing in the mud. She leapt onto the back of the second man and wrapped her arms around his neck. She squeezed and held on. The man let go of his victim and tried to pull the droid off of his back. She held on with everything she had, kicking him as she tried to choke his life out.
The woman he had been attacking got up and ran off, disappearing around a corner. Retz froze the feed and rewound it. He saved a screenshot of the woman's face before he played the feed forward again. The droid fought for all she was worth, but 2 against 1 was too much for her. Both of the men began to hit, claw, and bite her. One of them grabbed her under the arms, the other by the waist. They pulled in opposite directions, and the feed went into violent static and flickering as they tore her completely in half. When they dropped her, it was with her head pointing towards the other woman who had been attacked. She was frozen with fear. The 2 animalistic men grabbed her and ran around a corner out of view. The woman's screams followed her, dimming until they couldn't be heard any longer. Retz rewound the feed and got a screenshot of her, too. He sent both images to the PT he was using, disconnected the encryptics case, and logged off of the terminal. He looked down at the pictures on his PT. The first woman was a beautiful blonde, all legs and curves. Her eyes were green and her face stricken with terror. The woman who had been dragged off had an ink-black bob cut. She managed to get a tan in the dingy light of the slums, and it brought out the sapphire in her eyes. Both women had been attacked a little over 8 hours ago. One was kidnapped and the other escaped. He had their faces and the PT, but he knew how the police worked in the slums. Even with one of the women in mortal danger, the police would simply write her off as a loss, like they did all the people in the pit. If Retz didn't do their job, the woman would likely die. He knew that was just how the world worked, but that was part of Retz's natural design. He was fully, completely human. That meant thinking and feeling the same way humans did, even if most others had abandoned their compassion as the hindrance they perceived it to be. Some even bought mood-dampening mods. But no, he couldn't make that argument with himself, could he? He was more than willing to beat down and shoot jackers, and the complex machine felt so human it bothered him. He never cared to make ultimatums. He decided his actions on each case as they came up. And Retz decided right now that he did have to help. Not only because it was the human thing to do, but because the android was doing it first. He would not let a machine show more humanity than he was capable of. Otherwise, what was the point in refusing modifications for the sake of his humanity? Then again, if he was doing this just to prove who he was to himself, and not out of a sense of compassion, wasn't this just another megacorp move? Showing humanity only as a means to an end? To look good to someone rather than to help? Well, Retz thought to himself, I can't figure out my own life, can't figure out what I want, and nothing makes sense. But at least my life isn't boring. 1.5 Retz called it a day at the warehouse. He didn't explain to Gavin or Suds what was happening, just informed them that he needed the rest of the day to himself. He took the encryptics case and the PT with him back to his own terminal at home. There, Retz edited the video contents just to show the deranged attackers. He censored the faces of the women who were attacked and made sure his access to the net was anonymous, hiding any trace of who or where he was. He uploaded the video and asked if anyone had ever seen such a thing. Retz knew it would take time to get any responses from his inquiry, so he focused on another task. He took the picture of the woman who had escaped and cropped it to the cleanest shot of her face that he could manage. He used reversed image searching programs and facial recognition software, hoping to find where she lived. Across social media platforms, most people tended to remain anonymous. Digital identities were so prevalent and meant so much more to people than their actual identity that the majority of free net users preferred to remain in anonymity. However, having an ex-wife that worked security for the largest megacore supplier of security programming software and hardware did have its perks. From a time that seemed long forgotten, Retz employed old skills. He found the woman's general location with some effort, locating matching images of her face through public security feeds. He still didn't know her name or exactly where she lived, But there was one public street she always came from at the start of the day and returned to at the end. She had to live in one of the houses or a shack or connecting street or alleyway. Retz had the picture of the kidnapped woman and her friend on his PT, his cigarettes, his lucky lighter, and his sidearm with a 7-round speed-loader magazine. He left his house and headed for the woman's neighborhood, or at least the area around where it should be. The walk was uneventful, giving Retz plenty of time to think about things he often tried to ignore. Things like Clarissa and how happy they had been when they first met. She had fallen in love with the idea of a man without any biomods. Retz couldn't be sure, but had always thought that she fell more in love with the idea of a man who had no distractions other than her. She loved the spotlight, desired to be in it at all times. When Retz was done working, he would get home and focus all of his time on her. He had no mods or DNL, so his life was spent with and for the people he loved. And he had loved Clarissa. Still did, if he wasn't lying to himself, which he always was. When they first met, he was simply attracted to her, and didn't see any fault in that. She was a blonde-haired, hourglass-figured bombshell. As time passed by, he had grown to love her attitude, her personality, her determination to rise to the top. Retz had always admired strong-willed women, and Clarissa was one of the strongest. She took what she wanted and dared everyone to try and stop her. But things change the older you get. Things Clarissa once found attractive began to bother her. Retz was having a harder time finding steady work, and he was growing older and had no mods to hide the fact. The time he spent with her that had once seemed like never enough was now far too much. She urged him to change, to get modded, to stop being so stubborn. Out of anger, Retz had pointed out how he loved Clarissa for her personality and hadn't asked her to change. In response, she had asked him how she could love a dead man. It was true, partly. Retz was dying at a faster pace than the rest of humanity because he refused to get the treatments and mods that extended the human lifespan. Clarissa would likely be alive at least 3 decades longer than he would be. In her own words, she had refused to continue loving a man who would leave her broken and destroyed for so long before she passed away with him. Retz lit a cigarette and sucked in the first hit. It felt like nothing. There was no ease as nicotine dripped into his system. He was smoking now to avoid the withdrawals. He felt no pleasure in it, and the petulant teenage angst nestled in the deep recesses of his mind refused to admit that he was smoking to die faster. Retz knew he had come to the conclusion that he wanted to die, but he refused to accept the knowledge as pure fact. He put himself in dangerous situations and pushed his luck when life spit in his face because he wasn't sure he cared at this point. Not anymore. Not after everything that had been taken from him, because he wanted to be untouched by the future. He shook his mind free of all distracting thoughts. He needed to focus, to never turn away from the next task. If he slipped, his years would catch up with him and he would collapse under their weight. Retz showed the woman's picture to a passerby. He had seen her around and pointed Retz in the right direction with an arm that was made of metal. The man walked away with a cigarette between his lips, lighting it with the flame that came from his index finger. Retz wasn't afraid of the future. He hadn't been modded because he was defiant towards what humanity was becoming. He didn't want to be part machine, part code, part flesh. He wanted to be fully human, with all of its disadvantages and all of its sincerities. When he dragged his fingertips across Clarissa's neck, she couldn't feel certain places where tech had been installed. The man who had just helped Retz could never again touch another human and feel them. Shaking a firm hand or giving a gentle touch to someone in pain, or even stroking a beloved pet. Was losing all of that worth a strong arm and a built-in lighter? Retz rounded a corner and saw a line of single-story buildings only a few feet apart from being connected. The buildings were shabby and unkempt, but they were much nicer than the sheet metal shacks, and they were self-contained. This was the neighborhood that he had been pointed to.
He walked to the first building and knocked on the door. A bleary-eyed man with a shadow of stubble across his face and a stained wife-beater answered. Retz showed him the photos of the woman, and the man nodded. He had seen her around. She lived here somewhere. Retz tried the next door with no answer. The third and fourth gave no answer either. The fifth was an older woman who told him it was the 8th building. Retz thanked her, skipped the next 2 homes, and knocked on the door of the 8th. And there she was. She looked wary, but the terror and horror wasn't evidenced in her body language or facial expression. It was like the ordeal hadn't even happened, like she'd forgotten it. Retz wondered for a moment if she had suppressed it mentally or through drugs. He wondered if she was high right now. "Good evening, ma'am," he said. "I'm here investigating the disappearance of this woman." Retz held out his PT with Pixie Cut's image. "Have you seen her? She disappeared no more than 24 hours ago. I got reason to believe she was abducted." The woman stared at the picture for a long time. "My name's Jan," she said, her voice on the cusp of breaking. "Come in." Retz pocketed his PT and stepped inside the home. The woman walked through a partition between the living room and what he assumed was a kitchen. He didn't know what she was doing, but he heard her shuffling around. Retz looked at the room he was in. The small space was almost barren. There was a couch against the far wall and 2 chairs near the front door, one of which he took a seat in. Between them was a small coffee table with an empty vase sitting in the middle. Besides that, there was nothing in the room. No carpet to cover the patternless laminated floor, no picture on the gray polyfiber walls, and no curtains to cover the closed blinds on the windows. The woman came back into the living room holding 2 small cups of steaming tea. She sipped out of one and handed the other to Retz. "She's back," Jan said as she sipped her tea. "Pardon?" Retz asked, looking at the dark brown tea and setting it on the table without drinking it. "Mona," the woman said. "My friend, the picture you showed me, her name is Mona. She's already back." Retz nodded once. "Back from where?" The woman looked Retz in the eyes. She was gauging what he knew, what he felt, like she was trying to figure out which lie would work on him and which wouldn't. She must have seen something in his face that gave away his unbalanced attitude after watching the recording from the android. "From being kidnapped?" Jan finally said, her voice now clear with no hint of fear or concern. Retz's right hand twitched towards the gun that was shoved into his pocket. He didn't reach for it, and hoped Jan didn't notice the twitch. "Can I speak to her?" Retz asked. "I don't think that's a good idea," Jan said. "I don't really know who you are, and shouldn't the police be talking to her?" "We both know the police don't care about the slums, and I'm after the 2 guys that did this. They're the ones I need to find." As soon as the words left Retz's mouth, he realized his mistake. Jan knew more about what was going on than he did, and he had just let her in on his secrets. He knew that the perpetrators were men, and that there were 2. Jan knew now that he had seen the whole thing unfold. "I think you need to leave," Jan said, setting her cup of tea down and straightening her back as she sat up. She put on a brave face, but the fear and nervousness was coming back into it. "Yes, ma'am," Retz said, standing slowly and keeping his hands at his sides. He didn't know what was going on, but he certainly didn't want to spook the woman who had more answers than he did. "But not until I know Mona isn't hurt or in need of a doctor." "She's fine," Jan said. Retz slowly raised his hands to either side of his head. "I get it," he told her. "You just want me out. But that's not gonna cut it. I don't even need to talk to her anymore. I just want to know she's alive." Jan's eyes slid shut. She sighed and stood up. "Fine," she said. "Just remember that I wanted you to leave." Retz's heartbeat increased. He held his breath as Jan walked back into the kitchen, waving him to follow. He reached into his pocket and thumbed the hammer back with a coat-muffled click. Around the edge of the wall was indeed a kitchen. There was also another room beyond the kitchen, the door to this one shut and locked. Jan unlocked the door and pushed it open to reveal what must have been her bedroom. She took a step back and motioned Retz inside.
"Ladies first,"
he mumbled, but Jan just shook her head.
"Can't stop now. There's answers in there."
Retz stepped into the room, his hands in his pocket. His left hand was clenched into a fist, his right already wrapped around the gun. Retz looked to his right, a wall and a bed. He looked to his left, Mona, crouched on the floor like an animal, her clothes torn and her features strained and feral. "What the?" Retz tried to say before she pounced on him. Retz brought his gun out of his pocket before the collision, but wasn't able to get it up before he was tossed onto Jan's bed with Mona on top of him. Retz tried to bring his right arm up to deter her with a loaded gun, but she had his wrist in her left hand and she was far too strong. Her right hand reached up and clamped down on his throat. She squeezed with so much force that all thoughts of deterring Mona disappeared under the panic for survival. Retz readied his left hand to punch her in the mouth until he realized that her lower jaw had been replaced with some kind of mod. Without much time to wonder what was going on, he readjusted his aim to her temple and struck as hard as he could. She didn't even flinch. She just hissed, and then opened her mouth wide enough to stick his entire head inside. The bio-mod on her jaw whirred and clicked as it expanded large enough for a coiled jack to slither free. Retz felt his brain itch from the recesses of his skull. It evolved into a high-pitched whine that only he could hear. He had no idea what was happening, but the terror was trying to break his mind. He fought the urge to scream, and lost.
"She's trying to connect to my brain,"
Retz realized as she flipped him over with ease. Now, more than any other moment in his life, Retz felt absolutely justified in refusing to get a DNIP. In the confusion Mona experienced looking for his neural port, she let go of his arms and grabbed his head with both hands to closely examine where it should have been. From his stomach, Retz raised the gun upside down and blind fired every round through his coat and in her general direction. Mona screeched like an animal and Jan screamed in terror from the gunshots. Retz rolled onto his back and leapt off the bed to reload the cylinder with his speed-loaded magazine. He dumped the empty shells onto the floor and missed twice when loading the bullets into the cylinder. Mona was lying on the floor near the opposite wall, twitching. She had been grazed across her right leg, hit twice in the chest, and had a hole above her right eye that oozed blood. Retz spun to his left and pointed his gun at Jan. "What happened to her?" Retz asked, his voice shaking.
"I don't know,"
Jan said.
"You killed her."
"She was gonna kill me," Retz said. "What was I supposed to do, just let her strangle me?"
"She was getting better,"
Jan said, her voice lilting in a dreamlike manner. It sounded like she was starting to lose it.
"She was so confused, so upset. She was wild, but she was getting better. She was getting as good as I am now."
"What?" Retz asked, still panting from the excitement.
"You could see it in her, you know,"
Jan droned.
"When she first came and got me, she was an animal. I was a better version, but I was helping her and she was gonna be like me."
Retz thumbed the hammer back once more and placed his feet in a firing stance. "I don't like the sound of what you're saying," he said. "You're making me nervous and I have a loaded gun." In the distance, something howled. A screech came in response. A moment later, 2 more howls, these much closer. Someone banged on the front door with solid blows. "What was that?" Retz asked.
"They're here," Jan said. "They're here to take her back. And now they're just gonna find a body and they won't be happy."
Retz pushed Jan out of the way and stepped around the wall to look at the door. The wood of the door cracked under the weight of another blow. A face with bloodshot eyes and a stupid, gaping jaw peeked into the window next to Retz. In under a second, the looker reared back and shattered the window with his face. Bleeding, he growled and yelled at Retz. Retz put a bullet in the man's head and 2 more through the door. "Stop!" Jan said, but her voice sounded wrong. Retz turned to look at her just in time to see the makeup on her jaw crack and split.
Her mouth opened as wide as Mona's had, and the same coiled jack snaked out. "I ain't got a port!" Retz yelled, his voice squeaking as it came out. The appendage struck anyway. Retz pulled his left arm up in front of his face, and the jack's needle pierced his flesh. The needle dug deep and deflected off his ulna, sending a jolt of pain up Retz's arm. He yelled as the jack pulled out of his arm and coiled like it was going to strike again. Retz pointed his gun and blew half of Jan's right knee into red chips. She fell to the ground, wailing as Retz stomped the tentacular jack against the floor. He grabbed it near the needle that had stung him, twisted, and pulled. He strained, not giving up, and feeling his arm pulse with pain until the jack cracked and tore free. Lubricant, wires, blood, and sparks pulsed from the torn ending as Jana screamed, "Kill him!" through her protracted jaw. Retz put a lead slug into her head. "It is definitely time to go," he said. The maniac at the door had broken through and was charging. Retz dove out of the way, landing on Jan's couch. The dive broke the legs, and the couch crashed to the ground, one of the armrests disconnecting and falling away with a string of fabric and a tuft of cotton. One of the crazed men from the window looked down and raised his foot to stomp on Retz. Retz aimed up and fired twice, one of the bullets hitting the man in the pelvis and the other going through the bottom of his jaw. Retz pushed himself to his feet. The crazy man charged again. Retz grabbed the coffee table, knocking both cups of tea to the floor, and spun around with it. Like an oversized baseball bat, he broke the small table in half across the man's side. Retz ran for the door and ducked around the edges of its ruin. He slid to a stop outside, looking both directions. His home was to his right, and the street there was empty. The neighborhood ran further down his left, where a dozen or more maniacs were hollering and hooting as they ran on hands and knuckles like primates down the street towards him. Retz turned and ran for home. 1.8 Suds was the first to burst through the door, SMG in hand. He was followed by Gavin, his shotgun slung over his shoulder. Retz's right arm snapped into position, revolver solid in his right hand, barrel pointed right at Suds. "Whoa," Suds said. "It's just us." Retz sighed and lowered his gun. "What are you two doing here?" "Corpos are heading this way," Suds said, slow and calculated. "They're looking for your little case you took from the dead hooker. Almost fried my meat suit. Got anything you want to tell us, Red?" "Yeah, actually, there's monsters out there." "Monsters?" Gavin asked. "Yeah. Wait, who's watching the ARF?" "It burnt down," Gavin said with a shrug. "Now tell me what you mean when you say monsters." "There are people and droids who are adding DNL jacks to their mouths. They look normal till they're close and they try to connect to your port." "Why?" Suds asked. "I don't know," Retz said. "I didn't want to see how pissed they'd be that I didn't have one." "How many?" Gavin asked. "I saw at least a dozen before I came here." Suds grimaced and looked out of the crack in the basement's hatch. "And this place is still secure?" Retz hesitated. "Retz," Suds hissed. "No one else knows about this place but us three, right?" A call started coming in on the terminal. Suds sighed. "It's just Claire," Retz said. "Chill out and let me take this." Retz unlocked the terminal and accepted the call. Clarissa's face appeared on the screen, her eyes wide and face shimmering with sweat. "Retz?" she asked, her voice frantic. "Retz, if you're there, get the hell out of the pit right now." "Claire?" Retz asked. "What's wrong? What's going on?" Claire growled in frustration. She knew Retz wouldn't move a muscle without a good reason why. That was how he stood his ground during all the years of mandated biomod laws. She would have to tell him at least a little bit for him to listen to her. "Dynamics is about to flood the pit," she said. "Is that enough for you?" "They just tried to boil my CPU in my titanium skull," Suds said, frowning. They sent a jacker after us and burnt down our shop. There's corpos on the way into the slums. Why bother if they're just gonna flood the place? Because something got let loose down there, Claire said. An experiment. They're sending who they can to collect what they can, but no matter what, they're gonna kill everyone in the pit. She paused, cocked her head, and snorted once. Glad you made a few friends, Retz. I didn't think you had it in you.
How do you know?
Gavin asked.
I'm PR,
Claire said with a mirthless smile, her avatar turning to face him.
They asked me to start working on a bogus story about how it was an accident and we're all just devastated and ready to make contributions to rebuild.
What was it that got loose? Retz asked, because I saw some real weird shit down here just a few minutes ago.
It's an AI.
Everyone in the room went still. Retz's blood ran cold. Suds's adrenal tapper let a few drops loose to keep him focused instead of scared. Gavin started to flex his muscles and shift his weight, nervous energy building up. Claire looked disappointed in herself, like she knew this was something that could happen and just let it.
What does it want?
Retz asked, his voice small and quiet.
We don't know, Claire said. It's calling itself the Stoker virus, and it hasn't made any demands. They put it into a person. A human mind, Retz. He broke out of his cell in some prison lab and infected everyone there with it, droid and person alike. They all spilled out into the slums. The corpos are there to tie up loose ends, make sure nothing breaks quarantine, and bring back at least one living sample. If this gets out, it could literally be trouble on an apocalyptic scale.
Claire, Retz said, realizing what all this meant for her. They're gonna kill you if they realize you called me.
Then hang up and get out, she said. How is it infecting people? Suds asked. Neural ports, Claire said. If you let someone get to it, you're as good as dead. Any other questions? I have all day, or at least until they put a bullet in my head for this.
Retz reached over and disconnected the call.
Hey, Suds said.
No time, Retz told him. If she's telling the truth, everyone in the pit's gonna die, and we got no idea how much time is left.
Then we get to the elevators,
Suds said with a strange grin.
What about everyone else?
Gavin asked.
Are we just gonna let everyone down here die?
As opposed to what?
Suds asked, his frown returning.
Staying here and dying with them? Let's tell who we can on a beeline to the elevators. You can sleep well knowing you were a hero and saved a few.
Suds is right, Retz said. We really need to get out. Now, if we make it, we can testify against Dynamics for... Gavin and Suds both laughed. They didn't stop, not for several moments. Gavin had to wipe tears from his eyes. Retz just sighed. Yeah, he said, I know.
We leave, now, Suds said.
We save who we can on the way,
Gavin added. Retz nodded.
And we don't die.
1.9 The net blazed with panic and rumors. It didn't take long for shaky videos of attacks to circulate the slums. Animalistic droids and deranged people leaping on each other, attacking, self-modifying, and spreading the Stoker AI like the virus it claimed to be. The only thing spreading faster than the infections were the rumors of a government quarantine and whispers of megacorps planning on flooding the pit. People's feeds flickered with an emergency alert, and alarms blared through the slums, slowly being drowned out by the screams and cries of its people. Retz sprinted ahead, weaving through the panicked crowd, his eyes fixed on the far wall of the pit where the surface elevator was. Suds moved like a shadow, slipping between bodies without a second glance, his focus cold and unyielding. Gavin lagged behind, his shotgun slung across his back as he bent down to lift a woman who had fallen, her leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Gavin hoisted the woman to her feet and urged her forward, only to watch her collapse again. Gavin bent down to help her back up. Suds never looked back. He slipped out of sight towards the elevator and was gone. Everything had gone to hell so fast.
One moment, Retz thought his friends were the only ones that knew what was going on. The next moment, the net had reared its ugly head and shown its power to everyone in the slums. Everyone knew now that they were mere moments from death. Crowds of people fought and shoved each other, running for the surface elevator. There's no way it would hold them all, and all those people knew it. Some fought each other. A few people had been shot dead in the mud, and in the distance were the howls of the maniacs getting closer and the shrieks of their victims being cut short. One of the monstrosities leapt from somewhere and landed with a shuddering slam on a sheet metal roof. It hissed at Gavin before the roof twitched and collapsed in on itself. Someone inside screamed. "Gavin, we don't have time," Retz said, but he said it as he ran to the woman and grabbed her other arm. The two of them helped her hop towards the elevator, slow and stumbling. "Retz, let go," Gavin said. Retz did, but Gavin didn't. "What?" Retz asked. What's going on?" "You're not helping," Gavin said. His extra-tough muscles hissed, steamed, and contracted as Gavin flipped the woman over his shoulder and began taking solid, slow steps to the elevator. "Keep them off of me," he said, "and don't lag too far behind. You don't have any speed mods to catch up." The creature that fell through the roof of the house slammed through its front door, knocking it from the building and sending it rattling down the street. Retz took careful aim, then 1 extra second to adjust, and fired. The bullet went through the thing's brain. Circuit board fragments and skull chips went flying, and the creature collapsed. From down the street, 6 more rounded the corner, then another 2 on the rooftops, and 2 more. Like hyenas sensing a wounded fawn, the creatures slowly emerged from every open space, every nook and every cranny. They were all staring, hungry at Retz. "Gavin," Retz said, "we're not gonna make it without your shotgun." "Then take it," he said, undoing the sling and letting the weapon splash into the mud behind him. "I'm not leaving her." Retz growled in frustration, but he picked up the shotgun and slung it over his shoulder. He took careful aim down the street and picked the closest creature. It was a droid, so a headshot didn't guarantee that it would go down. He aimed at the next closest, one that used to be human, and fired. It dropped dead. The rest of them charged. Retz cursed and stroked the trigger with abandon until the gun clicked empty. One of the creatures was on him, its hands almost around his throat. Retz pistol-whipped the droid hard enough to dent its head and break the gun. Retz threw the useless weapon down the street and took aim with the shotgun. He fired, pumped another shell in place, and fired again. He didn't even know how to aim the thing properly. He had never used such large weaponry. He put all of his focus into the proper amount of body weight to lean into each shot, so he didn't topple forward from too much or back from too little. Only a few more of the things were blasted into scrap before Retz pumped the shotgun and pulled the trigger on an empty chamber. It let out a surprisingly loud and crisp click. He readied the gun like a baseball bat and leaned into the oncoming assault. Sounds of distant gunfire began to die down. The screams grew quieter. The battle was ending and the sounds of chaos were dwindling. Humans weren't quiet about winning fights, which meant the pit was losing. They stumbled out of the labyrinth of rusted shacks and narrow alleys. The slum sprawled behind them while the stench of blood, oil, and antifreeze clung to Retz's coat. The elevator loomed ahead, a towering column of steel and glass piercing the smog-choked air above the pit. Its lights blinked faintly through the haze, a beacon of salvation amidst the chaos. "We're gonna make it," Gavin said. Retz didn't dare reply. He was using all his available oxygen to keep himself on his feet and moving. He knew if he stopped to say a single word, he would collapse and it would all be over. He turned around to see just how much further they had to go. The elevator was already surrounded by creatures. A half-dozen people were in the elevator trying to start it, but the rest of the crowd were howling, raving lunatics. Infected, all of them. The only other person still alive and making his way to the elevator was a lone corpo. He had a sword and a pistol and looked like the specter of death in a pitch-black suit. Every step he took, he dismantled another one of the infected.
In his wake were bodies upon bodies, and then a single cop running to keep up. The corpo made it to the elevator and began relieving the entire crowd of their limbs. He was like some kind of machine, a modern Valkyrie, an untouchable wraith that killed everything it beheld.
Look at him go, Retz thought. Maybe the future was always gonna swallow us whole. I think I always knew that. Wonder why I ran from it so hard.
Gavin and Retz made it to the crowd and stepped through the field of limbs and bodies to get to the elevator gate. The corpo made it first and reached out for the button to turn on the elevator.
"Wait!" Gavin shouted. "We're right here!"
The corpo paid them no mind. His hand had almost reached the console before another came out and grabbed his wrist. It was Suds. He looked scared, his eyes pleading instead of threatening.
"They are my friends," he said. "The only ones."
The corpo yanked his hand back like Suds was made of raw sewage, but he didn't reach for the console again. Gavin made it first, heaving the woman carelessly onto the elevator with a thud and screams of pain. Retz made it next, but there was no more room. The last free spot on the elevator had been taken up by Gavin. Retz would need to wait for it to go all the way to the surface and come back down again. With a quarantine coming in, it likely wouldn't be coming back down.
"Come on," Retz whined. "You can make room for one more. Gavin can suck in his gut."
"No room,"
the corpo said.
"What about the cop?" Gavin asked. "Isn't it his job to put his life on the line?"
Retz shook his head.
"Nah, Gavin, I'm not going."
The corpo smiled.
"Moot point, cop's mine."
Retz looked at the cop. The man's eyes were bloodshot and he was panting.
"That cop's infected,"
Retz said. The people on the elevator began to murmur. One of them screamed. The corpo lost his smile and reached out to the console. He pressed the button, and the gate for the elevator started to close. Retz reached into the elevator, grabbed the cop, and yanked. The corpo moved impossibly fast, his biomods whirring and hissing. There was a streak of black and a shuffle of movement. The cop fell face first into the mud outside of the elevator, a few of Retz's fingers lying with him. Retz looked at the stumps where his last 3 fingers used to be on his left hand. The cut was impressively clean. He stumbled once, the sight actually kind of sickening to behold. He stumbled a second time. Then Retz went down. 2.0 The corpo withdrew a hypo and walked up to Retz.
"No,
Retz groaned. "Don't want it."
"The nanites will stop the bleeding and deactivate. You'll just piss them out."
"Don't care," Retz said. "No metal in me, please." He undid his belt and tied it around his left wrist. The corpo walked up and drew his sword. He pressed a button and the blade began to glow red hot. He snatched Retz's wrist and pressed the heated blade against the bleeding stumps. Retz screamed as the pain rushed into him all at once. He screamed again. He screamed until the pain finally became numb, bearable. He looked up the elevator shaft. Still no return cabin.
"Hack it up, slummer,"
the corpo said with perfect composure.
"You did kill us, after all."
He pointed with his sword. Retz turned to see the dam on the far south end of the pit. The corpo was counting down.
4, 3, 2, 1, boom.
Balls of fire erupted from the dam in several key spots. The wall didn't come crumbling down, but 24 massive holes appeared in the dam and seawater began rushing in. The sight took Retz's breath away, and for a moment he couldn't feel the pain in his hand. When he realized the gravity of what had just happened, he turned to the corpo.
"Why'd you get off?"
he asked.
"For him,"
the man said, poking the cop with the tip of the sword. A bead of red blossomed on the cop's shirt where the sword pricked him.
"I put Stoker in him. He was my sample to bring back." "Stoker is an AI,"
Retz said. The corpo smiled, all perfectly white teeth save one molar that was shining gold.
"That's why we have so many buyers."
The corpo tapped his temple once and said, "Primary package is lost. Sending data burst." The man bent down to the cop. "Feed," he whispered to the creature. The cop's jaw spun and clicked as it opened itself for a cable to come slithering out. "Wish you could get to the cloud," the corpo said to Retz. "No DNL," Retz said, tears running down his face as he realized just how cemented their death was. Corpos didn't lose a meat suit for nothing. This guy knew it for sure. They were gonna die down here. Retz didn't let himself sob, but the tears were something he couldn't help. They would be washed away soon enough. "I've never met one of you before," the corpo said with genuine fascination. "It's amazing, really. I'm honored. You might be the last." "The last of who?" Retz asked. "The humans," the corpo said, before the cop's tentacular jack pierced his DNL. The corpo screamed and twitched. He looked up into the sky and a short surface-only EMP blitz ran through his body to shut off all the electronics touching him. It killed him and the cop instantly. It was a data burst. He had just uploaded the AI to something, somewhere. Retz turned to watch the floodwaters come gnawing at the city. His world was eating itself, and everything he knew was being swept away. He wondered what his life meant. He hadn't done anything with it, had he? The world would move on without him as it had been doing his whole life. Staying human hadn't made any difference to anyone. In fact, he could have saved lives like Gavin did if he wasn't human anymore. Was pride at being fully human really worth preventable deaths? Retz could feel the rumbling in the mud now. It would be only moments before he was drowned in the violent smashing of the ocean as it came to recollect the land they stole from it. Retz thought about the dead corpo at his feet. The man had called him human, said he hadn't seen one before. "I hate them all," Retz thought, "every last corpo, but damn it, he called me human." The thought stung with a poisonous pride that brought disgust and peace to Retz in equal measure. He squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the inevitable. The end. The cold, crushing finality of it. He had never been a part of the world above, and it was fitting that he should die in the one he spent most of his life. And yet, something lingered. A spark. Not hope, not redemption, but something else. He had held on, didn't he? He hadn't surrendered to the new, hadn't become like them, not even for Claire, not even for survival. He had been human. And maybe, just maybe, that meant something, even if it was only to himself. He thought back to the corpo's words. The man had said them with wonder, not with malice. Retz realized that was worth something to him. Retz braced himself. He wasn't ready. He never would be, but that was the way of the world. He spent his entire life proudly accepting whatever being human had cost him. Here at his death, he'd do the same. He stopped bracing himself. "I want a cigarette," he said to no one. He shoved his hands in his pockets and started walking to the nearest convenience store. He heard the elevator descending behind him, but he kept walking. He smiled. His friends made it out, and he had held on to something. Not a future, not a cause, just a fleeting, desperate moment of being. And for once in his life, the long struggle felt like it had been worth it, that this feeling in his chest was enough. He fished around his pocket and found it, the lucky lighter. He laughed. At first it was mirthless, ironic, then it was genuine. He fished out his PT and sent Claire a voice message. He told her the most honest, beautiful words he could about how much he loved her. He apologized for his faults and thanked her for the years they spent together as he casually broke the glass door of the nearest store and robbed them of a single pack of cigarettes. He sent his voice message, lit the cigarette, and smiled as the world made by the slummers in the pit finally ended.